Most Americans are unaware of the unique political status held by American Indian tribes and the special relationship that exists between tribes and the United States government. The concept of sovereignty is the foundation upon which this status and this relationship are built. In this program, we'll investigate some of the most common questions people have about tribal governments and what empowers them. First of all, it's important to establish this little-known fact. In addition to being members of ethnic minority groups, American Indian individuals are also members of tribes, and Indian tribes are political groups ruled by their own governments.
Because so many people don't have a background in Indian history, Indian policy, we're not taught this in our high schools or even college courses. Indian tribes are governments. And I think even understanding that basic fact is difficult because here in the United States we have sort of an ethnic group model, an immigrant model. We have this idea of different African Americans, Italian Americans, Irish Americans, and then we hear Native Americans, and we sort of think in those terms. But American Indian people, American Indian tribes are governments.
As a matter of fact, tribal governments are one of the 4 types of federally recognized governments in the United States. These are city governments, county governments, state governments, and tribal governments. American Indians are unique in that they have dual citizenship, both as citizens of the United States and as citizens of their own tribes. And as this continent's first inhabitants, American Indians are unique in other ways as well.
Well, American Indians are the original people of this land. We know from archaeological evidence that American Indians have been here at least 13,000 years in North America, and perhaps even longer. And the tribes that exist today are descended from those first people that have been here over the millennia.
From the beginning of contact with European immigrants, Indian tribes were considered to be nations that exercised sovereignty. France, England, and other European nations entered into treaties with Indian nations. So, while individual Indians are mostly like everybody else in the country, they are also citizens of pre-existing tribal nations. And those nations have certain powers and rights recognized by the U.S. Constitution and the Supreme Court.
So American Indians are considered to be pre-existing peoples ruled by their own governments, which qualifies them to be called nations. Legitimate governments rule on the basis of their sovereignty. So what is sovereignty, and how does this concept relate to tribes?
Sovereignty is the internationally recognized power of a nation to govern itself. And Indian tribes existed as sovereign governments long before Europeans settled here.
Treaties between European powers and later the United States formalized a nation-to-nation relationship between these powers and Indian tribes. Even the U.S. Constitution recognizes Indian tribes as distinct governments. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution specifies that Congress shall regulate commerce with and enter into treaties with foreign nations and with Indian tribes. By making treaties with the U.S., Indians gave up certain rights in exchange for promises from the federal government. These promises included the right to education and health care, hunting and fishing rights, the rights to live on land called reservations, and others. Trust responsibility is the term used to describe the government's obligation to honor these promises, which boil down to a promise to protect the best interests of the tribes and their members forever. During the 1800s, the rights of individual Indians and their governments were put to the test in the U.S. legal system. 3 Supreme Court decisions from that time period serve as a cornerstone for understanding the sovereign status of Indian nations. Johnson versus McIntosh concerned the validity of a tribal land grant made to private individuals. In this case, the court ruled that tribal rights to sovereignty had been impaired by colonization but not disregarded, and held that the federal government alone has the right to negotiate for American Indian land. In the case known as the Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, the Cherokee tribe of Indians sued the state of Georgia because that state had assumed powers it didn't have when it seized tribal lands. The decision in this case described Indian tribes as domestic dependent nations and maintained that the federal tribal relationship resembles that of a ward to his guardian. The Worcester versus Georgia case concerned the application of Georgia state law within the Cherokee Nation. This Supreme Court decision established 3 things. Tribes did not lose their sovereign powers by becoming subject to the power of the United States. Only Congress has plenary or overriding power over Indian affairs, and state laws do not apply in Indian country. The powers and rights discussed here only apply to federally recognized tribes. Many groups and subgroups of Indians exist in the U.S. boundaries, but not all have established their own independent relationship to the federal government, which maintains a specific set of criteria used to determine if a tribe falls into the nation-to-nation relationship. The federal recognition application is a grueling process that can take from 10 to 20 years to achieve. Over the years, Congress has passed numerous laws that have modified the powers of tribes and further defined their nation-to-nation relationship with the federal government. The first came in 1934, when Congress passed the Indian Reorganization Act. This law reversed trends that had been set in motion in the 1890s that progressively stripped tribes of their rights to self-government and self-management of local assets. The Indian Reorganization Act, known as the IRA, established standardized tribal political structures for tribes that wished to deal with the federal government, creating the elected tribal council structure, which is still employed by many tribes today. The Indian Self-Determination Act of 1975 made it possible for many tribes to become more self-governing by contracting with the federal government to run their own health care and social service programs. These programs have to meet certain standards and requirements in order to remain under control of the tribe. In 1978, Congress passed the Indian Child Welfare Act, which established procedures state agencies and courts must follow in handling Indian child custody matters. The law created dual jurisdiction between states and tribes that differs heavily to tribal governments. Without a doubt, Indian gaming has sparked more controversy and created greater awareness about tribal sovereignty in the general public than any other Native American-related topic in recent years. Issues related to Indian gaming will be more easily understood now that we've examined tribal sovereignty. So let's delve more deeply into this area. If a tribe decides to engage in casino gaming, the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act, or IGRA, controls these operations and requires that state governments must negotiate in good faith with tribes to form a compact or agreement that sets forth allowable games, limits, and other terms.
Indian tribes are not casino owners, primarily. So what they therefore do with the casino revenue is very, very different than what the CEO of a big casino in Las Vegas or New Jersey or other commercial industry area states would do with the money. What they use the revenue for is to run their government. And what do governments do? They take care of the health of their community through health centers, Indian health centers. They build schools and provide scholarships for higher education for their students. So I think that members of the general public, I think it's important for them to understand what the revenue is used for.
When it comes to managing tribal casinos, each tribe operates its own gaming enterprise in a way that works best for them. Some manage their gaming property themselves, while others contract with outside management or gaming corporations to manage their casinos. In any case, the tribe always makes the final decisions. Law enforcement agencies from local sheriffs all the way up to the FBI have investigated allegations that Indian gaming is a magnet for the mob or is run by shady characters from Jersey or Vegas. In every case, no links to organized crime were ever found. The Department of Justice has even stated that there is no evidence of any kind that organized crime has anything to do with Indian casinos. Indian gaming is subject to more stringent regulation and security controls than any other type of gaming in the United States. IGRA, the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act, sets out the procedures and levels of this regulation. The first level is the tribal level. Each tribe has its own independent tribal gaming commission to watch over operations within their tribe. The next level is state, through what's known as the Tribal State Compacts. Finally, there is federal regulation through the National Indian Gaming Commission and federal agencies such as the Department of Justice, the Treasury Department, and the Department of the Interior.
It goes back to the beginning of time when Indian people hold each other accountable, and we have a real strong ability to do that. So, and the bottom line is we have to be accountable to our membership, and our membership demands accountability and integrity.
When it comes to money, people seem to have a lot of questions like, do Indians pay taxes? Individual Indian people pay all taxes required by state and federal laws. Individual Indians pay federal income tax, Social Security, and FICA, as well as state income taxes. However, since it is illegal for one government to tax another, Indian tribal governments do not pay taxes to state governments or the federal government. Tribes do pay a percentage of casino revenues to the state as specified in tribal state compacts, and that amount varies from state to state. It is important to understand that only about 1/3 of tribes in the U.S. have any form of gaming, and the success of these operations varies widely. In fact, only 20 tribal casinos account for more than 50% of all Indian gaming revenues. In summary, we can say that the U.S. government recognizes American Indian tribes as domestic sovereign nations that possess self-government. Tribes have a nation-to-nation relationship with the U.S. federal government, and state governments generally do not have powers within reservations.
In case your knowledge of California history is a little rusty, here's a quick review. First, of course, was the indigenous era that began at least 13,000 years ago, an extended golden age where native people prospered with their languages, religions, and cultures intact. The Mission era saw the first wave of immigrants arriving on indigenous lands. Immigrants determined to colonize the area and use the indigenous peoples as their labor force. During that era, the Spaniards managed to deplete native populations near the missions by about 80%. The Mexican era caused the further collapse of native populations, communities, cultures, and lifeways. as the missions gave way to vast ranches that relied on forced Indian labor for their success. The end of Mexican rule came with the defeat of Mexico in 1848, and the discovery of gold in Northern California later that year opened the floodgates of Anglo-American intrusion into the area. Entire native communities were enslaved or slaughtered. California became a state in 1850, and an Indian killing campaign, complete with state funding, was immediately authorized by the governor and state legislature. The extermination of American Indians almost became a civic duty. The indigenous peoples of California who survived this history did so by hiding and/or disguising their true identities. Acknowledging your Native American heritage was suicide. Better to pretend to be anything but Indian, and to ensure your children's continued survival, don't ever mention American Indian heritage to them.
For non-Native people, it's incredibly difficult to hear the stories that have happened to Native people in this country. For myself, every time I heard a new story, I just didn't believe it.
Cross-cultural psychiatrist Donna Schindler has worked with indigenous people in New Zealand, Navajo Nation, and California.
When I moved to California, I was told that there was a bounty for Indian ears even in the 1930s. And again, I didn't believe it. So it took a long, long time for me as a psychiatrist working with people every day who are natives to actually get to the point where at this point, everything I hear, I know it's true. You know, I have no doubt in my mind at all, but I think for other non-Native people, it's a process. So when you hear about the missions or the gold rush, it's very difficult, and we tend to deny things because the stories are just too much for us.
Well, on the very first day that they arrived at the missions, their clothing, their garb, whatever they were wearing was taken away from them.
Tribal Chairman Valentin Lopez has worked tirelessly for the benefit of his tribe and other Native Californians to correct falsehoods in history.
And they were given a top and pants that was very hot, very scratchy, very itchy, very uncomfortable. But they had to wear it. They were told very clearly that they were no longer allowed to speak their language. They couldn't sing their songs. They couldn't do their traditions and their ceremonies, etc. The other thing they did there is that they would separate the men from the women from the children. That was intentional so that they could break the culture from generation to generation. That was very specific for that reason. French explorer La Perouse, I believe that's how you pronounce his name, he talked about the whippings of the Indians, how the Indians were just constantly whipped. They were whipped if they slouched in church, if they didn't look like they were prayerful enough, if they didn't work hard enough, if they asked for more food, they would get whipped. And it was just constantly. Sarah is on record that the only way that you can control the Indians is with blows. That's what Father Junipero Serra said himself. If the Indians ran away, they would send the soldiers to bring them back, and then the Indians would be whipped. The mission period was followed by the Mexican period. During the Mexican period, persons who had connections with the governor of California, they would receive huge land grants, sometimes 250,000 acres. What the owners of those ranches wanted to do is they wanted to develop huge cattle, sheep, pig, horse ranches. That's what they wanted, because they would sell the hides. There was a very active trade of hides. These ships, these supply ships would come on in, and they would just load up thousands and thousands and thousands of hides to be taken to New York or to Europe to be made into handbags and other objects and items and stuff like that. So in California, there was no labor force. The Indians were the only ones here. So during the Mexican period, that was an era of slavery for California Indians as well. They could not leave. Once again, they were captured in 1839, I believe it was, where an Indian ran away. He wanted to get away from the ranch that he was forced to work at. The ranchers, they sent people out to capture him. They lassoed him by the neck and drug his body all the way back to the main compound there and left the body there for a number of days to put fear and intimidation into the Indians who were there, that letting them know that if they ran away, that is what would happen to them. Next came the American period. The American period was incredibly brutal, incredibly horrendous to California Indians. The impact was felt primarily on the Indians in the mountains, because in 1848, that was the year they discovered gold up in the Sierra Mountains. And so now you have hundreds of thousands of people coming across the United States to go to those mountains, but also you have hundreds of thousands of people coming from around the world to come to stake their claim for gold up in those mountains. The Indians, there were tribes lived there. 150,000 Indians were up there. And whenever they went up there, those Indians would fight for their land and defend their land and try to get them off. Well, the California and the federal government looked at that as an Indian war. And so they each came up with a solution. There was a federal solution and a state solution. The federal solution was to sign a treaty. And so they sent commissioners over here to negotiate treaties with the California tribes. It was going to be 18 reservations spread throughout north to south of California. It would have covered 8.5 million acres, and all California tribes. It would have applied to all California tribes. Our Amamutsun tribe was a signature to that treaty. After it was signed, they took it back to Washington, D.C. to be ratified. During that period of time, however, the state of California got together and they passed a resolution asking the President and the U.S. Senate to not ratify the treaty, stating that they opposed that treaty. The President ordered that that treaty be sealed for 50 years, and it was never ratified. And our people who signed that treaty waited and waited and waited with the belief that they would be getting land so that our tribe and our culture could be restored and survive. The state solution to the Indian problem was extermination. The governor, in his very first State of the Union of California, stated that there will be a war of extermination against the California Indians, and that was inevitable. Shortly after that, a number of things happened. The state passed a treasury bond for the extermination of Indians. Can you imagine the state of today we issue treasury bonds to develop schools, to develop highways, to develop waterways, and et cetera. But they passed a bond here in California for the extermination of California Indians. California citizens and mostly institutions were buying treasury bonds, to make profits off of the extermination of Indians. That effort there raised over $700,000. A lot of that $700,000 that was raised was used to pay bounties for Indians. 25 cents to $5 bounty was pretty normal for a dead Indian. So they would some people would bring in over 100 scalps at a time and turn it in to collect their bounty. They also paid militias to go up to the mountains to find the Indians and to kill them. In total, $1.7 to $1.8 million was spent to exterminate California Indians. Imagine those first Indians that were taken to the mission. They separate the families, they take away their culture, they take away their natural environment, they take away their spirituality, their ceremonies, their customs, their way to keep balance in their life. How do those parents teach those children to have love, to have hope, to have happiness, to know that tomorrow is going to be a better day, to know that they are good people, to know that they're important, they have value? That did not happen. Now imagine that happening over 2 or 3 generations during the mission times. 1 or 2 generations, and continuing for another 1 or 2 generations during the Mexican time, and continuing for another 2, 3, 4, 5 generations during the American period, where there's no hope, no love.
500 years of genocide and forced assimilation into dominant societies has caused a scar on people throughout the world, on Native people in particular, indigenous people. And this scar can be passed down from generation to generation. These days it's called historical trauma. It's also called intergenerational trauma. People who suffer from historical trauma tend to have high rates of domestic violence. Along with historical trauma goes depression, massive amounts of depression. So there are epidemic rates of suicide within Native communities. There's also epidemic rates of homicides. And along with that goes substance abuse. And substance abuse can be seen as a way for people to self-medicate.
What I ask of all people, Native and non-Native, is that they insist that the true history of California be told. Don't allow the history of the last 100 years, that history that was told in our schools, the history that was told by state parks, by markers, by the Catholic Church, that false history. Don't allow that to continue. Insist that the true history be told. There's a lot of publications that are coming out now. This is just very recently these books are coming out. But they are exposing the truth, and they're exposing the truth with irrefutable references and knowledge. That's important. And we ask people to insist that those be brought into the curriculum. At the same time, we ask people to recognize that there's a lot of healing that has to be done, and to work with and support Indigenous people's efforts to heal.
He even announced an executive order to apologize for the historic mistreatment of Native Americans in California.
We apologize on behalf of the citizens of California to all California Native Americans for the many instances of violence, maltreatment, neglect, murder inflicted on the tribes.
The governor also announced a Truth and Healing Council, allowing the state's Native Americans to provide their historical perspective.
For more information about any of the topics discussed in this program, visit your local library or take a trip to the Indian reservation nearest you. Thank you.